There's some research that has shown that freshwater ecosystems account for 55% of all the global or non-marine ecosystem services, but they take up only 4% of the landscape, the terrestrial landscape. So that means that everything else, the forests, the grasslands, the tundra, the deserts, that encompass 96% of the remainder of the terrestrial surface of the planet, provide less than half of the services. So just hugely important. And then finally, they're also some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet.
It's no accident that, civilizations through time have often taken root right proximate to major floodplain areas. And that's because they are so food rich, biodiversity rich, beautiful agricultural soils, wonderful vistas for urban areas to develop around, like you see throughout the world through time. And so now we're in a pickle.
Floodplains by design was created to break down the walls of the silos, basically. And, it's about bringing tribes and local governments and farmers and engineers and vulnerable communities and others together so we can manage these river corridors, these rivers that we depend on for so many things in a more collaborative, holistic, coordinated way.
Welcome to Nature Is, where we brainstorm, share innovative ideas, and have conversations to stir our spirits and elevate our actions for a better world. Hello and welcome to Nature Is. Today we're fortunate to have two guests with us. Bob Carey, the Director of Strategic Partnerships with the Nature Conservancy, and Guillozet, the Watershed Program Director of the Bonneville Environmental Foundation, both joining us from the West Coast of the United States this morning. Welcome.
Wonderful to be here.
Thank you.
Bob, let's start with you. You have an incredible background with over 20 years of experience in the field of conservation, with a particular focus on empowering communities and building partnerships. Before we start to highlight this multi-stakeholder partnership, can you tell us why rivers and floodplains as ecosystems are so important?
Well, apart from the fact that they're just beautiful, our lives depend on freshwater ecosystems. People and most species, pretty much all terrestrial species, literally cannot live without water. But in addition to just survival, freshwater systems are critically important to the well-being of our communities and economies in other ways. There's some research that has shown that freshwater ecosystems account for 55% of all the global or non-marine ecosystem services or benefits that people get, but they take up only 4% of the landscape, the terrestrial landscape. So that means that everything else, the forests, the grasslands, the tundra, the deserts, that encompass 96% of the remainder of the terrestrial surface of the planet, provide less than half of the services. So just hugely important. And then finally, they're also some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet.
So shifting then to the initiative that we're highlighting today, can you tell us how the Nature Conservancy work led to the Floodplains by Design initiative?
Floodplains by Design was created to break down the walls of the silos, basically. And it's about bringing tribes and local governments and farmers and engineers and vulnerable communities and others together so we can manage these river corridors, these rivers that we depend on for so many things in a more collaborative, holistic, coordinated way.
Cass, we'll shift over to you. Now that we have an understanding of the role that the Nature Conservancy and other stakeholders played in the foundations of this initiative, can you tell us how you became involved and the Bonneville Environmental Foundation's role?
So we became involved partly in response to learning about the opportunity as TNC was stepping away from that key center role. We had been doing similar work in Oregon with a similar set of partners, same issues, complex floodplain management challenges, really urgent need to support salmon recovery as well as flood risk reduction. And it really met our organization's objectives of kind of serving in that lean intermediary space as a supporting agent where there's kind of a background role. The implementing entities, tribes, agencies, other nonprofits are really the spotlight. The agencies and others are the funders. And there's always a lot of wheels to grease and friction to reduce and conversations to have that can just, we like to kind of say, bring ease into the system. And so it's a role we are really honored to get to play. Thankfully, TNC stepped back from that role, but as we say, they didn't step away from it. So we still work closely on a number of fronts with them, as well as American Rivers, a tribal liaison, and a whole host of other agency and nonprofit and tribal partners.
Oh, well, thank you, Cass. And I'll just draw on one of the references that Bob made around breaking down silos. Maybe you can give us a little bit more background on the ways that local communities, Indigenous peoples, local tribes have been involved specifically in this collaboration.
So they're not really only just involved, they kind of are the collaboration. Essentially, we're the background players doing small things to help money and policy and other elements flow. But the implementing partners in the local communities where these projects are occurring are everything. They're the ones with the decades of, pre-conversation, relationship building, planning along agricultural resilience, salmon recovery, tribal treaty rights, urban development and growth. We're here speaking today, but honestly, it's so many dozens of other people who are doing the actual implementation that are the real center of the program.
That's so often the case, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And are there ways that you're seeing local communities really utilize funding from the Floodplains by Design program?
Oh, yeah. And we hear over and over again, it's inevitable that a lot of these funding programs do get more rigid and restrictive. And that Floodplains by Design is not immune to that. But there's ongoing efforts to kind of keep pushing for ease and meeting community needs. But we hear over and over again from tribal partners, urban, local governments, that the flexibility of the actual funding is what makes it special, as well as Bob was describing that lack of siloization. So a group can really come together, forge a shared vision, and they do have to cobble together multiple grants to make these projects work because they are huge. It does provide flexible funding to meet a building setback objective, a stormwater system improvement, a salmon habitat objective, and more. And so that's what's pretty novel, is the flexibility to support the collaboration, which is actually something we want to emphasize more and more, because that time and resource for groups to be able to work through local challenges is what every community in the world needs right now. And that's what's so special about FBD. And then the flexibility of the funding for meeting local priorities.
Well, that's really helpful. And rethinking these collaborations is such an important component.
Lara, can I interject and say, make a couple comments about the collaboration and how it works?
Absolutely.
Thank you. First, we think of Floodplains by Design at the highest level as a public-private partnership. And the role that Bonneville Environmental Foundation is what we think about as like the NGO backbone in that is super important. And BEF has stepped into that role really effectively because they're an organization that puts the vision in front of their organization. And they're there, as Kaz was saying, to serve the interests of the network of tribes and partners around the state. And that role is super important. But the state plays a huge role in this. The state legislature that has been super supportive and generous in the appropriations they've made to the Floodplains by Design grant program, and the State Department of Ecology, which manages that program and has been pretty cutting edge in their willingness to work with the Nature Conservancy and Bonneville Environmental Foundation and the tribes and local stakeholders and partners we work with in sort of this collaborative way to really, sort of listen to the needs of the community, manage the program in the flexible ways that Kaz was just talking. It's not every day you find a state government or agency willing to work in that way. And it's really unique and important to this work.
And I want to add to that, these investments in nature-based solutions make a ton of sense. So for every dollar invested in these floodplains by design projects that reduce flood risk, $7 is saved in flood recovery, post-flood actions. And so, yes, it is generous and wonderful of the state to make these investments. It's also incredibly smart.
Exactly. And I mean, I think that's a great segue to how we think about this work and floodplains as a nature-based solution, which is an area that is really increasing in focus globally as a climate solution. And so that's a really helpful point. Maybe you can give us some insights into how these floodplains are really acting as nature-based solutions, specifically thinking about beaver reintroduction, log jams, remeandering, initiatives like that are utilizing the way that the systems used to be.
Cash, you want to go or you want me to go?
You can go ahead. I can follow.
Yeah, well, I'd say, part of the reason that we hear that there's increasing emphasis on nature-based solutions is that we've learned through many decades of real-world experience that nature is powerful. Nature always wins, right? And even like a lot of the flood control engineers that we work with talk about how there's two types of levees or dikes, those that have failed and those that will fail, right? So nature-based solutions are about working with nature as opposed to against it. So it's about, giving rivers more room and reintroducing some of those natural features that absorb the brunt of extreme weather events.
And I would add, it's no accident that, civilizations through time have often taken root right proximate to major floodplain areas. And that's because they are so food rich, biodiversity rich, beautiful agricultural soils, wonderful vistas for urban areas to develop around, like you see throughout the world through time. And so now we're in a pickle where we've got a lot of development, a lot of hard infrastructure in these critically important ecosystem areas. And we talk about making room for the river a lot because we know and we can see from aerial photos and more, rivers are dynamic. They move. They know best.
No, absolutely. And so much of this, as we were discussing earlier, really resonates with me in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem and the flood that we experienced a couple of years ago with the Yellowstone River. Sometimes there's too much water. Sometimes there's not enough. Sometimes it's in the wrong place at the wrong time. So as you design this work, how does the thought process work so that it is benefiting our modern day communities as well as nature, which I realize are combined?
So it's tricky as we talk about what we think systems used to be and what they are now. But we do know they're dynamic, they're changing. We can do much by investing in opportunities to take people out of harm's way, restore those natural systems, and support the communities in their efforts to continue to craft these good solutions moving forward.
We think about this as systems change work, right? These are dynamic systems that people will live in and work in for many, for as long as we can see and imagine into the future, right? So we're not crafting solutions that we think will exist for centuries, right? Rather, we're trying to move things in a direction that increases the resilience of the communities that live there and ecosystems that occur there.
Well, and this goes back to one of your earlier points, which is the broad number of stakeholders that you had to bring together for this local community collaboration. So farmers, Indigenous, Native tribes, local townships along the rivers. How did you do that? Because these are not always stakeholders that see eye to eye, and I think that links nicely into some of the policy work that you were referencing that's obviously scaled to a state level. But maybe you can share with us some of your learnings from bringing all of these people together to find a common ground.
Well, the first thing I would say, and Kaz, you should lean into this too, is that we're bringing some of those interests together at a state level and trying to listen to what's happening in communities and watersheds around the state to inform what we do at a state level. But much of the work that you're describing is happening at the local level and is not happening because of the Nature Conservancy or Bonneville Environmental Foundation. It's happening because of the tribal governments, the local governments, the leaders in those communities that are pulling the other partners and stakeholders together to develop these holistic, integrated plans and projects that serve the greater interests of their community.
Well, I really like how you're highlighting this grassroots approach and thinking about what all of these different stakeholders have in common and starting from there. And that's a great lesson, I think, for many rural communities to learn from. But if we're thinking about how this community work has bubbled up to policy outcomes at a state level, help us understand a little bit more about that trajectory.
Well, I can speak a little bit about the Climate Commitment Act, and then Bob, I know you can too. So this was a fairly landmark legislation passed just a few years ago to essentially establish a cap and invest program that generates revenues from emitting industries and then reinvests those into climate resilience in activities throughout the state. So Floodplains by Design saw a bump from that funding, which added up to about $17 million going into 4 Floodplains by Design projects that were funded in the current biennium. And your mention of the Cherry Declaration, it's really an illustration of how climate change is hitting industries throughout the state of Washington, center, east, west, north, south. It's an iconic crop for the region, cherries. And due to a really excessive heat wave that occurred, the crops in Oregon and Washington were both really heavily impacted, which led to an economic crisis.
We can't take credit for those programs, but I think what FBD, the collection of FBD actors have done has shown that nature-based solutions and this more collaborative, holistic way of working works. And that has then influenced other programs and policies. So as the Climate Commitment Act was passed, this Cap and Invest program, there's a very significant amount of funding that then goes out to communities to implement nature-based solutions to flooding and climate change and drought and other climate impacts.
And I'll add, what can be really hard is when we have these flashes of money hitting systems, because the real complex projects take time.
Are there key lessons or takeaways that you would like to leave with the audience, or any visions that you have in mind for expanding this work more broadly outside of the Pacific Northwest?
Just like a healthy ecosystem, programs like Floodplains by Design show us how when you've got diverse organizations working together within their own niches, we sometimes like to frame things today in the news or in popular media as if everybody has to agree or things fail. And we just see that's not true. People working within their niches to advance their interests, the best circumstance is when each group or individual is empowered to advance its value set, and there's time and space to support collaboration, input of expert, technical information and more. And so that ecosystem of humans working to steward natural resources and these integrated, flood spaces is what makes them vibrant. And then another key takeaway, is simply that when people are mobilizing around places they love, amazing things can happen.
Floodplains by Design has been held up as an example, sort of a model floodplain management program nationally and internationally. And as an example of how we use nature-based solutions to adapt to climate change. There's a ton of really cool projects in the country and world that demonstrate the power of nature-based solutions and the multi-benefits that derive from them. But there's relatively few examples of collaborative governance structure, mechanisms that have really enabled that kind of work to get to scale and be integrated into how a state or a government at that scale does things, manages floodplains or responds to a changing climate or whatever. So what we're trying to do now is figure out, okay, what's the secret sauce? What are the key lessons learned here that we can bring to other states, and where are the opportunities ripe? So we're in conversation with a number of other partners and TNC chapters around the country about how to do that. And to me, there's a set of principles, collaborative processes where different tribes, local communities, others, they have real decision-making power. So I think that combination of the top-down incentives, whether they're policy or funding or whatever, coupled with the bottom-up capacity building, peer learning exchanges, that kind of thing that we've done in Washington, that helps empower and enable, build capacity in local communities to work in this new way has been super important. But then in addition to that, the funding and that bottom-up work, you need someone at the middle. This is systems change work, right? You need somebody that is constantly, coordinating and, convening, coordinating and iterating on how these programs work, because we don't have all the answers today. We need to continue to try things, learn, get better. And that's what BEF and Department of Ecology do for Floodplains by Design in Washington.
Well, thank you. I think this is such a helpful roadmap for actioning nature-based solutions and on so many different sides, thinking about the policies and the communities that are needed to really bring those to fruition. And always our last question, very much centered in nature, where are you both most at home in the natural world?
I'm most at home in the natural world. I love being outdoors, whether I'm in the mountains with skis on my feet or a backpack on my back, or in the ocean in a kayak. But to the theme of this conversation, it's often along rivers, the arteries that connect those mountains to the sea, where I'm most at home, or maybe most at peace, or most inspired or something. There's just something about the combination of power and beauty and sort of life-giving nature of rivers that's just sort of awe-inspiring for me.
I love that and agree. And I would say near any body of water, ideally around a blooming wildflower, and with bird song or, bird views. I was refilling our hummingbird feeder yesterday, and we've got the new rufous hummingbird migrants descending. There were dozens of them zipping around yesterday, and I was just thinking of what perfect kind of models for like an environmental worker hummingbirds are, because they're joyful and they're not afraid to fight. And so, learning from those models in nature is an ongoing joy.
Well, thank you both for those really beautiful descriptions and for all the work that you do to maintain these beautiful ecosystems that we all depend upon. Keep up the great work. I know this will be an inspiration for many other communities that call rivers home, and thank you.
Thank you for having us and for what you do and helping get the word out. It's
Yes.
Super important part of the work.